My wife, Pam, is from Cincinnati, Ohio. We traveled and stayed in Ohio for many years. The region has had an additional 100 years or so of rich American history. Ohio became a state in 1803. 1804 was the year the Lewis and Clark expedition was exploring the unknown West for the first time. We both were interested in history and often visited historic sites to learn from them. We visited the Golden Lamb Hotel in Lebanon, Ohio, and that was built in 1804. The Golden Lamb has had 12 presidents stay there. Author Charles Dickens, Mark Twain, Western star Annie Oakley, and author Harriet Beecher Stowe have all stayed there. Each of these historic characters have interesting life stories. Pam began reading the book, The Runaway Quilt, by author Jennifer Caverney, and I probably said her name wrong, sorry. Jennifer is from Cincinnati and now lives in Madison, Wisconsin. Inspired by the story of possible color signs and directions stitched into quilt patterns and designs, Pam wanted to know more and visit historic sites of the Underground Railroad. The Underground Railroad was by nature a secret place and a secret operation. The railroad theme was used as the railroad was a popular travel option of the day. Language was developed to tell stories of routes or tracks, guides or conductors, a series of safe houses or depots, and station masters, those who hid slaves, all helped the freedom seekers escape to freedom. The underground theme may have represented the fact that freedom seekers simply dropped out of sight as if going underground. Slavery of men, women, and children, predominantly from Africa, had been in operation for 246 years in America, from 1619 to 1865. This was followed by 89 years of segregation, ending in 1964 with the Civil Rights Act signed by Lyndon Johnson. One historian has written, "We are still living with the effects of slavery today. Enslaved people were considered by some valuable property, needed to run plantations, harvest labor-intensive crops like cotton. Other people saw this as a cruel and inhumane practice. Stories of slavery years have been well documented, and recordings of former slaves can be heard online, having been recorded in the 1920s. The stories reveal a range of conditions. Some experience masters who may never whip them, never separate family members, and provided clothing, meals, while others found themselves in horrific conditions with merciless whippings and beatings, fear and intimidation, the rape of women and children, family members who could be separated and sold at a slave auction. They may work long hours. There may be little medical attention. The injustice prevailed for centuries. For a slave, one would need a pass just to visit a nearby plantation. Being caught without a pass meant a whipping. It was not illegal to allow a slave to learn to read or write. This, however, was dependent on the type of owner. Slaves may have been taught that Yankees and Union soldiers would kill them. This was an effort to keep them from running away. We might imagine what it would be like to be a slave. There'd be fear, pain, hunger, no rights, no freedoms, and perhaps no mother or father. A former slave had witnessed a group of slaves going to auction in North Carolina and told the story in an interview for the book, My Folks Don't Want Me to Talk About Slavery. The book was assembled by a variety of interviewers. As a young slave, they recalled seeing slaves huddled together, walking down the street, followed by men on horseback. They were to be sold at auction January 1st. As they pressed down the street, they, quote, looked like a gaggle of geese, and, quote, some had no shoes in the snow, and, quote, snow clung to dresses like snow on sheep's wool. Opposition arose among former slaves, religious leaders, and ordinary citizens. Those involved became called the abolitionists. Frederick Douglass, a former slave, was a prominent speaker in free states and spoke with President Lincoln about the problem. By 1810, slavery in Canada had all but ended. And by 1834, it officially ended. This created a haven in Canada called the Promised Land. One way to get there was to cross the Ohio River or the River Jordan. One interviewed former slave stated they sang songs like Crossing Over Jordan and Bound for the Promised Land. While some enslaved people were able to buy their freedom, freedom seekers tried to escape to free states in the United States and to Canada, Mexico, Spanish Florida, Native American reservations, and the Caribbean islands. This was complicated as slave catchers or bounty hunters were hired by owners to return runaway slaves. The Fugitive Slave Act of 1850 made it illegal to protect slaves, but the Underground Railroad ignored this act and continued to assist the freedom seekers. It took some courage to try to escape to freedom. One story revealed by a former slave stated that two men had run from the plantation. Alone in the woods at night, they became frightened of bears that might be in the woods. They returned to the plantation, even with the possibility of a whipping, rather than face a bear in the dark woods at night. It is estimated that 1,000 people escape slavery each year, and 100,000 people found freedom with the help of the Underground Railroad system. From Western Kansas to the Atlantic Ocean, safe houses and assistance was rendered to the freedom seekers. Pam and I visited the Levi and Catherine Coffin house, built in 1839 in Newport, Fountain City, Indiana. Reverend Coffin and his wife, Catherine, were associated with the Quakers who opposed slavery. 2,000 people would be assisted by the Coffins. They were housed and they were fed and clothed by Catherine's sewing circle. The home always had fresh water, as it had a spring cistern for water in the basement. And removable panel was up in an upstairs bedroom. That could hide people in an attic space if needed. What I found most interesting was a wagon in the barn that had a false bottom. People would lay down, they were covered with boards that hid them, and then a mound of hay or grain bags was placed on the boards. The stowaways secretly were moved down the roads to the next safe house station on the railroad without detection. In 1847, the Coffin family moved to Cincinnati. They were to run a shipping business there. I had read a story of Reverend Coffin defending a former slave in court there. During the trial, when it was perceived that his client was not going to get a fair trial, the Reverend Coffin signaled to his client to quietly leave the courtroom while he distracted the judge. The man fled to the Coffin house before he was noticed as missing. Police roamed the area looking for him. Reverend Coffin, arriving home, had the man dressed in women's clothing, and together they walked down the road to freedom. Pam and I visited the John and Jean Rankin house in Ripley, Ohio. It was built in 1828 on a bluff overlooking the Ohio River. There were 13 children in the family. John was a Presbyterian minister and an abolitionist. It has been said a light was placed in the window or hung outside to guide freedom seekers. They would have to cross the Ohio River to freedom and climb the 100-foot pathway uphill to the Rankin home for safety. 2,000 freedom seekers stayed at the Rankin house, as many as 12 at a time. It has been said he and his family never lost a passenger on their railroad. Also in the town of Ripley, we visited the home of John Parker and the John Parker Museum. John was a former slave of a doctor in Alabama who allowed him to learn to read and write and keep the money he made at his foundry job. John purchased his freedom and moved to Ohio. John created several patents for his metalwork that he created in the foundry there. John ushered hundreds of people to the Rankin house and other safe houses in Ripley. John crossed into Kentucky and assisted others to freedom. On display at the Parker House Museum is a large wooden boat, the type he would have used to cross the Ohio River to secure those trying to get to freedom. Harriet Beecher Stowe relayed the stories of a mother and a child who successfully crossed the Ohio River while fleeing from slave catchers. This while the ice was unsafe. The story appears in her book, Uncle Tom's Cabin, which she learned of that story at the Rankin house. And I have read of Harriet Tubman, who we were able to see today, who escaped slavery and found freedom in Pennsylvania. She made 13 trips to nearby slave states by herself, blended into plantation populations, and guided hundreds of people to freedom in the North and Canada. She used the North Star to guide her, and her father taught her moss grows on the north side of trees, so they wouldn't lose their way. In one trip, she guided 70 people at one time. Harriet Tubman never lost a passenger while she was a conductor and was affectionately called the Moses of her people. Pam and I also visited the National Underground Railroad Museum in Cincinnati. That is where the John Rankin story of the trial escape was on display. At the end of the tour, we learned that to some degree, the tragic story of slavery continues on to this day in many parts of the world. It is also called human trafficking. When the country was deciding whether Kansas would be, and Kansas and the rest of the West would become free states or slave states, violence broke out when Missouri raiders tried to interrupt the voting process of Kansas settlers. People were killed over the issue. Within a short time, the southern states seceded from the Union. The Civil War had started, and violence lasted for 4 years. Slavery came to an end with the Emancipation Proclamation by President Lincoln in 1863 and the end of the Civil War in 1865. But life may not have improved right away. Imagine not having skills to make a living or to be able to even read and write. We were turned out like cattle, one Texas slave said, not knowing what to do or where to go. Shortly after freedom came, intimidation began by men in white robes who rode horses at night to frighten the former slaves. But they persevered. The human spirit of resilience is simply amazing. Let me share a few thoughts on social justice. To be sure, people have been behaving badly for a very long time. And at times, all races have been enslaved. I don't have all the answers for the social justice needs, but I am hopeful of the future. I like looking at the big picture of things. During my lifetime, I have seen improvements in laws and understanding of ethics and social justice. As Martin Luther King said, the long arc of history bends towards justice. During the mid-1800s, many people could see the injustice and pain of slavery, while many people could not. I like the simple reason Christ gave for difficulties in the world. He said, some people's hearts are hardened. With a hardened heart, they cannot see or hear what is right or wrong. So it is important to keep love in our hearts. If love is in our hearts, there will be little room for fear or hate. I love the term indigenous people use to talk about God. They use the words, the great mystery. They didn't have all the answers to life, but they felt that if the earth was given to them by the great mystery, then all the earth is sacred and worthy of their respect. If love is in our hearts, we will recognize injustice and justice. If we recognize all the world is sacred, we will have respect for the world and everything in it. Recently, my son was concerned about carjackings and violence in Minneapolis. And I said to him, that behavior should never happen. But remember, the Twin City area contains 2 million people. The vast majority would never harm another human being. There really is great good in the world. There really is great good, but we may not always hear about it. Newscasts often search the world for big stories, but seldom have time to cover the researcher, the doctor, nurse, farmer, teacher, EMT, scientist, delivery driver, or ordinary citizens who do great work for us as a consistent way of life. To be fair, I have recently noticed improvements in broadcasting with both good and bad news being reported. I love the river quote by Desmond Tutu. The wisdom of this quote may help many people learn to fix injustice. He states, there comes a point where we need to stop just pulling people out of the river. We need to go upstream and find out why they're falling in. As an educator, I strongly believe that education is the key to successes in life. At the end of my career, I learned that Wisconsin was #1 in the nation for ACT scores. Hudson Schools had its second highest ACT score in the state. About 95% of our students graduated on time in 4 years. And I know several of them who had health issues and completed their education soon after. Most students went on to a post-secondary education. But my upstream moment came when I learned Minneapolis graduated 49% of their high school students on time for that same year. Granted, there are language, economic, and social issues at play. But that seemed to me a deep concern. That should have never happened. Without education and some skills, it's hard to find success in the modern world. One can easily become discouraged or hopeless if opportunities are hard to find. Without hope, some may turn to anger and violence and crime. In 2020, the graduation rate in Minneapolis had increased to 74% of students that had graduated on time. This was despite the pandemic. So there is hope and progress is being made. Fred Rogers, of Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood, told an encouraging story of hope. As a child, he became afraid and discouraged by the events of the day. His mother encouraged him by saying, quote, "Watch for the heroes to show up." It's encouraging to know they always do, those who push back against dark events. Rescue workers and ordinary citizens who share, donate, and help out in some way. Only recently have we learned of the long ago heroes who showed up to help freedom seekers of the Underground Railroad times. My father once said, "It's easier to help others when our lives are in order." After we have our lives in order, find our lives are in order, try to do small acts of love. Put together, the small acts add up, making the world a better and brighter place. When you do, you join the forces of light. John 1:5 reads, "The light shines in the darkness, and the darkness shall not overcome it." When we share some love and share some light, we may find what Anne Frank wrote was true. She wrote, quote, how wonderful it is that nobody need wait a single moment before starting to improve the world." Thank you for listening.